Welcome to my history channel. This story may feel long, but if you stay until the end, you may finally understand how a war lasting more than a century was never just about kings, but about the birth of nations. Have you ever wondered what drives generations of men to march willingly into absolute slaughter? We often look back at the Middle Ages through a deeply distorted lens of chivalry and romance. We imagine brave knights in shining armor defending noble causes under flowing banners. But the brutal reality of 14th century Europe was far less poetic. Power was not a divine concept handed down by God. It was a bloody ledger of land, forced marriages, and endless political betrayals. The illusion of kingship is perhaps the most dangerous myth ever invented by human ambition. A crown does not grant absolute authority. It merely places a highly visible target upon the head of the wearer. In the High Middle Ages, the boundaries between nations did not exist as we clearly understand them today. Instead, the map of Europe was a chaotic web of feudal contracts, broken promises, and deeply conflicting loyalties. Consider the utterly absurd paradox that plagued the English and French monarchies for centuries. The King of England sat upon a sovereign and powerful throne in London, dictating laws and raising armies. Yet he was simultaneously expected to kneel in Paris as a mere subservient vassal to the King of France. How could a proud monarch possess absolute power at home, only to swallow his ego and offer submissive tribute to a bitter rival across the narrow sea? Human nature inherently despises submission, especially among those specifically bred and conditioned for absolute power. The English kings held vast and extremely wealthy territories within continental France, including lands like the Duchy of Aquitaine. These overseas possessions were often considerably wealthier and more culturally advanced than England itself. The French kings naturally looked upon these massive English possessions with deep paranoia, constant suspicion, and bitter resentment. They simply could not tolerate a rival so incredibly powerful operating so freely inside their own theoretical sovereign borders. The original sin of this massive geopolitical nightmare actually began with the Norman conquest in the year 1066. When a ruthless French duke crossed the Channel and seized the English crown by force, he violently and permanently bound the historical destinies of two entirely incompatible realms. For generations after the conquest, the English kings exclusively spoke French, consumed French culture, and relentlessly dreamed of expanding their ancestral continental domains. England was frequently treated as a mere financial storehouse, a convenient source of tax revenue to fund their grand European ambitions. The monarchs did not view themselves as truly English. They viewed themselves as displaced French aristocrats yearning for total continental supremacy. This was not simply a mundane dispute over geography or tax collection. It was a fundamental clash of intense psychological arrogance. The English Plantagenet dynasty truly believed their French blood and vast economic wealth made them absolute equals, if not undeniable superiors. Conversely, the French Capetian dynasty firmly believed their sacred anointing ceremony in Reims gave them incontestable divine supremacy over all earthly vassals. When two unbending egos saturated with absolute power violently collide, the only mathematically possible outcome is utter devastation. The peasants who toiled relentlessly in the mud cared absolutely nothing for these grand royal games of three-dimensional chess. They were tragically bound to the soil, sweating blood to generate the immense wealth that solely funded these extravagant noble fantasies. Yet when the wealthy lords frivolously declared war to satisfy their own insatiable vanity and greed, it was always the common blood that flowed most freely into the dark earth. The illusion of kingship required constant validation through extreme violence, territorial expansion, and the display of absolute military dominance. A king who did not aggressively expand his territory was instantly viewed as pathetically weak by his own deeply ambitious and predatory barons. Therefore, to prevent internal rebellion and constant civil war at home, monarchs deliberately had to direct the swelling bloodlust of their nobility outward toward a foreign enemy. War was never looked upon as a desperate last resort for peace. It was the primary engine of feudal political stability. To keep the knights from slaughtering each other, the king had to provide them with foreign peasants to slaughter instead. We must deeply examine the mindset of the medieval aristocracy to grasp the impending tragedy. To a knight, war was the ultimate theater of glory, the only stage where true worth could be publicly proven. They were raised on romantic tales of heroic combat, completely blinded to the horrifying realities of starvation, disease, and dismemberment. They saw war as a grand sporting event, completely disconnected from the human suffering it inevitably created. The kings surrounded themselves with sycophants who constantly whispered poisonous fantasies of unlimited empire into their royal ears. They lived inside impregnable castles of stone, deeply insulated from the starving cries of the common population suffering below. This profound echo chamber of wealth and privilege fostered a terrifying collective cognitive bias among the entire ruling elite. They truly believed that God exclusively favored their royal lineages above all others. However, the fabric of this archaic feudal order was already beginning to slowly and inexorably tear apart under the weight of its own contradictions. As economies grew and trade routes expanded across Europe, kings desperately needed more centralized power to tax and control their growing populations. The feudal system, with its decentralized web of independent lords and fragmented loyalties, was becoming a massive obstacle to modern statecraft. The King of France desperately wanted to centralize his fractured nation, which meant eliminating the massive English enclaves existing within his borders. The King of England desperately wanted to shake off the humiliating stigma of being a lesser vassal to the French crown. These incompatible desires created a massive geopolitical fault line running straight through the heart of Western Europe. Furthermore, the rising wealth of the merchant classes in strategic regions like Flanders complicated the traditional feudal loyalties. Flanders was technically under French political suzerainty, but its entire economic survival depended completely on importing high-quality English wool. Would these wealthy merchants support their theoretical French overlord, or would they side with their crucial English business partners? Economic necessity began to violently clash with ancient feudal oaths. The alliances were no longer dictated solely by noble bloodlines, but by the cold, calculating ledger of commerce and profit. The noble lords clung desperately to their outdated codes of chivalry, completely failing to recognize that the entire rules of global power were secretly shifting beneath their armored feet. Consider the impossible psychological burden placed upon the nobility of the disputed borderlands like Gascony and Aquitaine. These local lords were constantly forced to navigate a deadly diplomatic tightrope between two supremely arrogant masters. If they supported the French king, the English would burn their prosperous fields and destroy their castles. If they supported the English king, the French would brand them as traitors and confiscate their ancestral titles. Loyalty was no longer a matter of sacred honor or deep moral conviction. It had degraded into a desperate, calculating strategy for pure daily survival. The feudal oath, once considered the most sacred bond in human society, was reduced to a cheap currency exchanged and discarded based on whoever held the largest army at any given moment. The rot in the system was absolutely total and irreversible. Below this tangled web of elite deception lived the silent, forgotten majority. The peasantry trudged through short, brutal lives, entirely disconnected from the gilded halls of power. They viewed the distant kings not as holy protectors, but as terrifying natural disasters that periodically swept across the land to steal their grain and slaughter their sons. They had no concept of being French or English. They only understood hunger, cold, and fear. As the 14th century dawned, the delicate and hypocritical diplomatic balance between London and Paris began to violently fracture beyond repair. The archaic feudal contracts were simply no longer sufficient to contain the swelling, explosive ambitions of early national identity. A single ignited spark was all that was terribly required to spark a continental conflagration that would consume generations. The stage was meticulously set for a conflict so unprecedented in its brutality and duration that it would forever alter the definition of war. The kings dressed themselves in finery, sharpened their heavy swords, and blindly prepared to send millions of innocent souls straight into the abyss. They truly believed they were fighting a traditional war for feudal honor and overlapping territories. They could not possibly comprehend that they were actually tearing down the entire feudal system with their own violent hands. The illusion of absolute kingship was about to be brutally tested on the muddy, blood-soaked battlefields of northern France. The era of small, contained aristocratic skirmishes was over, and the terrifying age of total national war was about to emerge from the ashes. The roots of a century of relentless bloodshed were buried deep within the fatal psychological flaws of the feudal system itself. Chapter 2. The Seeds of Conflict. How does an entire dynasty simply vanish into the cold mists of history? For over 300 years, the Capetian kings of France had enjoyed what historians call the Capetian miracle. A continuous, unbroken line of fathers, passing the sacred crown directly to their lawful sons. This unprecedented biological luck provided France with immense political stability and deep psychological confidence. But the fates of empires are often dictated by the frailties of human biology. In the year 1328, King Charles IV died, leaving no surviving male heir to inherit his vast kingdom. The miracle had suddenly and catastrophically failed. The French nobility was instantly thrown into a state of absolute political panic and deep existential dread. When the main bloodline withers, ambitious men and women quickly gather around the dying trunk like starving vultures. Across the narrow channel sat Isabella of France, the sister of the deceased king. She had endured a miserable, humiliating marriage to the incompetent English king, Edward II, whom she eventually overthrew. Now she saw the ultimate prize waiting for her bloodline. Isabella possessed a ruthless political mind and an unquenchable thirst for royal vengeance. She demanded that her young son, King Edward III of England, be immediately recognized as the rightful heir to the French throne. Geographically and biologically, her argument was exceptionally strong. Edward was the direct grandson of the formidable French King Philip the Fair, making his claim incredibly potent. Imagine the absolute horror that gripped the powerful French aristocracy at this exact moment. The nobility of Paris despised the English, viewing them as uncouth foreigners and subordinate vassals. The very idea of crowning an English monarch in Reims and placing French wealth under London's direct control was philosophically unthinkable and politically suicidal for the proud French feudal lords. Therefore, the French elites frantically searched for a plausible legal excuse to deny Edward his bloody birthright. They deliberately reached back into the murky depths of ancient history to resurrect a conveniently forgotten legal code known as the Salic Law. This archaic Germanic tradition explicitly forbade the inheritance of property or royal titles strictly through the direct female bloodline. Law is rarely an objective search for universal truth. It is most often a manipulative tool for those already holding absolute power. The Salic Law was not a sacred French tradition. It was a frantic justification invented entirely to prevent a foreign invasion of the throne. It was the ultimate legal pretext designed to protect exclusive local noble privileges from foreign ambition. Instead of the English king, the French barons selected Philip of Valois, a distant cousin of the dead monarch. Philip VI was entirely French, culturally acceptable, and politically indebted to the powerful men who had just handed him a kingdom. They foolishly believed they had averted a massive crisis simply by rewriting the complex rules of royal inheritance overnight. Initially, the young Edward III surprisingly accepted this highly controversial decision with calculating silence. He was only 15 years old, desperately trying to consolidate his own fractured power within a highly rebellious England. He pragmatically traveled to France and performed the humiliating act of homage to Philip for his ancestral lands in Aquitaine. He bent his knee, but silently retained his boundless arrogance. But Philip VI made a fatal psychological miscalculation, driven entirely by his own insecurity. Because his claim to the throne was legitimately questionable, Philip felt a deep, constant need to project overwhelming strength and absolute dominance. He relentlessly provoked the English king, constantly interfering in the internal legal affairs of the wealthy duchy of Aquitaine to publicly humiliate Edward. The feudal contract existed as a delicate psychological balance of mutual respect and obligation. When a lord consistently humiliates his vassal publicly, that sacred contract irreparably shuts down. Philip relentlessly pushed Edward into a corner, demanding total subservience from a young monarch who was rapidly evolving into one of the most formidable and ruthless military commanders in all of Europe. The geopolitical noose around England began to tighten significantly in both the north and the south. Philip actively funded and armed Scottish rebels, encouraging them to violently harass the northern English borders. France was deliberately attempting to trap England in a devastating two-front war. This was no longer just about feudal honor. It was about absolute national survival and strategic dominance. Furthermore, the lifeblood of the English economy was under direct and immediate threat. The kingdom relied heavily on exporting raw wool to the prosperous weaving cities of Flanders, which were under French suzerainty. When Philip attempted to sever this vital economic artery, he touched the extremely sensitive nerve of English commerce. Money will always accelerate mass violence far faster than any diplomatic insult. On May 24, 1337, the French king committed the ultimate act of political arrogance. Philip officially confiscated the Duchy of Aquitaine, declaring that Edward had forfeited his lands due to disobedience. This was the point of absolute no return. A king can survive losing minor battles, but he can never survive the public humiliation of being dispossessed by a rival. Edward III responded with a masterstroke of utterly devastating political theater. He did not merely declare war to retrieve his stolen lands in the south. He audaciously reclaimed his title as the rightful king of France. By claiming the crown itself, Edward instantly transformed a regional feudal dispute into a continental war of absolute annihilation and regime change. This strategic declaration brutally fractured the loyalties of every single lord currently residing in France. If Edward was the true king, then fighting against him was an act of divine treason. Edward masterfully used the illusion of divine right to weaponize his own ambition. He offered the disgruntled French nobility a legitimate excuse to violently rebel against Philip in Paris. Neither king truly understood the horrifying monster they had just willingly unleashed upon the world. They still romanticized war as a short, glorious summer campaign that would be swiftly decided by a few honorable nightly skirmishes. They failed to grasp that the underlying economic stakes and deep national paranoia had already transformed this conflict into an unstoppable, devouring leviathan. As the armies gathered and the blacksmiths forged countless deadly weapons day and night, the common people looked up at the darkening skies with profound terror. The seeds of conflict had germinated in the cold palaces of deceitful kings, but the bitter harvest would be reaped entirely by the innocent. The stage was now set for the terrifying age of English dominance. The seeds of endless war are always planted whenever legal fiction is deliberately used to mask desperate political survival. Chapter 3. When war became inevitable. How do you prepare a nation for total war? It requires the systematic weaponization of propaganda, heavy taxation, and deep public fear. Edward needed to convince Parliament that funding his grand ambition was a matter of absolute national security. He masterfully painted France as an existential threat to their very survival. To counter the overwhelming numerical superiority of the French army, Edward resorted to the cold power of gold. He borrowed massive sums from Italian bankers, plunging his crown into staggering debt. With this borrowed wealth, he bought mercenary allies across the Low Countries. He constructed a fragile coalition bound exclusively by profit. We often romanticize the knight in shining armor, completely ignoring the horrifying logistical nightmare required to keep him alive. A single armored knight required multiple war horses and immense daily rations. To feed this massive machine, royal tax collectors ruthlessly stripped the peasantry of their winter stores. War was already slaughtering the innocent through starvation. The two armies represented two fundamentally incompatible philosophies of war. The French king commanded the most magnificent heavy cavalry in Christendom. These proud noblemen believed victory belonged exclusively to aristocratic blood and frontal assaults. They viewed war as a grand tournament. But the English king brought the terrifying weapon of the common man. The English longbow was a radical social disruptor. In the hands of a common peasant, it could unleash a deadly storm of armor-piercing arrows. It brutally democratized death on the battlefield. A poor farmer could now slaughter a wealthy duke from 200 yards away, completely shattering the historical illusion of noble invincibility. The illusion of a short campaign swiftly evaporated under the crushing weight of economic reality. The pressure to deliver a decisive victory drove both sides toward unprecedented acts of brutality. The nobility remained blind to the storm. The first decisive clash did not occur on solid ground, but upon the treacherous waves of the English Channel. In 1340, King Philip amassed a massive French fleet at Sluys. His objective was to annihilate the English navy. The French arrogantly chained their massive ships together like a wooden fortress. This static naval defense proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. The English ships maneuvered with the wind and unleashed a relentless hail of iron, tipped arrows upon the trapped French sailors. It was a unilateral massacre upon the water. Thousands drowned or were slaughtered on their own burning decks. The Channel turned red. The destruction at Sluys was so absolute that court jesters had to deliver the horrifying news to King Philip. They darkly joked that French sailors were brave for jumping into the sea wearing heavy armor. Beneath this macabre humor lay a terrifying reality. England now possessed undisputed control of the open sea. Having secured the ocean, Edward did not immediately seek a traditional honorable battle. Instead, he unleashed a devastating psychological strategy known as the chevauchée. This was a fast cavalry raid designed specifically to burn villages and terrorize the innocent peasantry. The goal was to systematically eradicate the economic foundation of the French crown. Imagine the absolute terror of the peasant watching his entire life turn into ash, while his French lord cowered safely behind castle walls. The chevauchée masterfully destroyed the very core of the feudal contract. If the French king could not provide basic security, why should the devastated peasants offer him their loyalty? The nature of war had irreversibly mutated before their very eyes. It was no longer a glorious sporting event limited to nobles. It had become a total war of exhaustion, economic sabotage, and mass psychological terror. The illusion of chivalry was dead, clearing the path for the terrifying age of English dominance. When the logistics of war overwhelm the fantasies of chivalry, absolute slaughter becomes the only viable strategy. Chapter 4. The Age of English Dominance. How does an invincible empire suddenly crumble into dust? The year was 1346. King Edward III did not merely invade France. He launched a calculated expedition of absolute terror. As he marched across Normandy, the French King Philip desperately pursued him with an army vastly superior in both numbers and wealth. The French nobility were intoxicated by their own arrogance, believing the English would swiftly flee or surrender. They finally collided at the muddy slopes of Crécy. The French elite, dripping in gold armor and blinded by the flawed fantasies of chivalric glory, charged carelessly into the fray. They did not even wait for their own infantry. But the English did not play by the ancient rules of aristocratic combat. They had deployed thousands of common longbowmen, standing behind sharpened wooden stakes, waiting with cold, terrifying discipline. The sky suddenly turned pitch black as tens of thousands of iron-tipped arrows rained down upon the disorganized French cavalry. The deafening sound of shattering armor and screaming horses echoed across the valley. It was not a traditional battle. It was an industrial slaughter of the European aristocracy. The proudest knights of France were dragged from their horses and brutally butchered in the bloody mud by peasant daggers. The contrast was absolutely staggering. The French fought for individual vanity and highly lucrative ransoms, while the English fought with the mathematical efficiency of total annihilation. The flower of French nobility was entirely wiped out in a single humiliating afternoon. The archaic era of the armored knight was brutally executed by the callous hands of the common English farmer. Yet human warfare is constantly mocked by the unpredictable wrath of nature. In 1348, just as the English seemed unstoppable, a silent and invisible enemy swept relentlessly across the sea. The Black Death engulfed Europe, brutally slaughtering nearly half of the entire population. A microscopic pathogen achieved a level of mass devastation that no human king could ever possibly comprehend. The war temporarily paused under the crushing weight of mass graves. However, the psychological trauma inflicted upon the survivors was monumental. The starving peasants watched with awakening clarity as the plague indiscriminately erased both the wealthy duke and the beggar alike. They realized that death cared absolutely nothing for noble bloodlines. The rigid, divine hierarchy of the feudal system began to rot from the very inside. But the horrors of the plague did not cure the ruling elites of their insatiable greed. A mere decade after Crécy, the war violently resumed under the command of the ruthless English heir, the Black Prince. At the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, the French nobility miraculously repeated their exact same catastrophic mistakes. They charged blindly into English arrows out of desperate pride. This time the humiliation reached an unimaginable climax. King John II of France, desperate to prove his personal valor after years of defeat, charged directly into the chaos. He was surrounded, beaten to the ground, and captured alive by the English forces. The absolute unthinkable had actually happened. The sacred, anointed sovereign of the French nation was now a helpless hostage being paraded through the streets of London. France was instantly plunged into the darkest abyss of complete anarchy. Without their king, the surviving nobles began tearing each other apart for control. Unpaid mercenary bands roamed the devastated countryside, ruthlessly pillaging the very citizens they were hired to protect. The English dominance seemed so absolute and final that they believed The 100 Years' War was already permanently won. The glorious illusion of aristocratic invincibility was permanently shattered by the cold, lethal pragmatism of the peasant soldier. Chapter 5. The Collapse of France. We must now examine the profound vulnerability of a nation deprived of its core leadership. With King John held captive in London, the Kingdom of France effectively disintegrated into a terrifying state of chaos. The very pillar of the feudal system, the absolute authority of the crown, had been violently removed, revealing the deep, festering resentment hidden beneath the surface. The concessions extracted by the English were unprecedented in their brutality. The Treaty of Bretigny, signed in 1360, demanded an astronomical ransom for the king's safe return. More devastatingly, it granted England complete sovereignty over nearly a third of the entire French territory, free from any feudal obligation to Paris. It was a complete and utter capitulation. However, the true nightmare for the French peasantry was not the distant political treaty, but the immediate collapse of internal order. Left without pay or purpose, during the fragile truce, the unemployed mercenaries formed ruthless brigades known as the Free Companies. These hardened killers roamed the countryside, systematically extorting towns and slitting the throats of anyone who resisted. The nobility, who swore sacred oaths to protect the weak, now locked themselves safely inside, their heavily fortified castles, pointedly ignoring the agonized cries sufferings outside their thick stone walls. The peasants slowly realized a chilling truth. The aristocracy would ruthlessly squeeze them for extravagant ransoms, but would never actually risk their lives to defend them. This profound betrayal of the feudal contract ignited the Jacquerie in 1358. It was a violent, spontaneous uprising of the desperate French peasantry, driven entirely by blind rage and searing hunger. They burned castles to the ground, slaughtered the arrogant lords, and brutally assaulted their families. In a desperate attempt to reclaim basic human dignity, the nobility retaliated with absolute, unrestrained savagery. The peasants were systematically hunted down like wild animals and massacred by the thousands. Yet the psychological damage to the feudal order was permanent. The commoners learned that their masters were not divine protectors, but merely exploitative parasites. It is during this absolute nadir of French fortune that a crucial change in leadership changed the course of history. King John ultimately died in captivity, unable to secure his own staggering ransom. He was succeeded by Charles V, a man known not for his martial prowess, but for his exceptional intellect and calculating pragmatism. Charles V was physically frail and fundamentally despised the romanticized carnage of the battlefield. He realized that confronting the English in glorious pitched battles was absolute suicide for the French forces. To survive, he had to fundamentally deconstruct the entire philosophy of French warfare. The age of reckless aristocratic charges was officially abolished. He deliberately chose commanders like Bertrand du Guesclin, men promoted solely for their cold tactical brilliance rather than their extravagant noble pedigree. Du Guesclin pioneered a relentless strategy of asymmetric attrition. He refused hand-to-hand combat, opting instead to ruthlessly harass English supply lines, starve their garrisons, and retake castles through cunning stealth rather than brute force. This radical shift demanded immense psychological discipline from the proud French nobility. They had to swallow their intense desire for immediate vengeance and embrace the slow, unglamorous grinding away of the English machine. Slowly but surely, Charles and du Guesclin masterfully dismantled the English conquests, proving that cold strategic logic always triumphs over blind aristocratic pride. When the sacred bond of protection is broken, the society devours itself from the inside out. Chapter 6. The Rise of Strategy over Honor. How do you defeat an enemy who simply refuses to fight you? The concept of a just war in the Middle Ages required two armies to meet upon an open field, trusting God to grant absolute victory to the righteous. This was the supreme theater of justice. But King Charles V and his brilliant commander, Bertrand du Guesclin, completely erased God from the military equation. They replaced divine judgment with the cold, merciless mathematics of attrition. Strategy replaced honor as the highest virtue of the state. To the proud French nobility, this calculated restraint looked exactly like trembling cowardice. They were explicitly ordered to lock themselves inside their sturdy castles and silently watch the English burn their ancestral lands to ash. Imagine the excruciating psychological torment of a highly trained knight, gripping his sword, in the shadows, forbidden by his king from riding out, to defend his bleeding peasants. This was not merely a change in military tactics. It was a fundamental rewriting of the feudal psychological contract. A lord was divinely ordained to protect his serfs from physical harm. By voluntarily abandoning the open fields to the pillaging English, the French crown was tacitly admitting that the old order was dead. Pride had to be violently suppressed and swallowed daily for the sake of ultimate national survival. The English responded to this frustrating silence by launching even more massive and destructive chevauchées, desperate to provoke a decisive pitched battle. They arrogantly assumed that the French elites would eventually break their discipline under the burning shame of continual humiliation. The English commanders systematically burned ancient monasteries, slaughtered livestock, and razed entire villages to the ground, attempting to force the invisible French army out into the open. In 1373, Joan of Gaunt, the ambitious son of the English king, led a colossal army straight across the entire expanse of France. He intended to deliver the final, crushing blow to the trembling French monarchy. But his mighty army found absolutely nothing but scorched earth, poisoned wells, and heavily fortified stone walls. The French had deliberately stripped the countryside of every single grain of wheat and every drop of wine. They marched for 5 agonizing months through an apocalyptic wasteland of their own making. They fought absolutely nobody, yet they were slowly being consumed by rampant disease, bitter cold, and relentless hunger. The French guerrilla fighters shadowed them in the dense forests, silently slitting the throats of stragglers and foragers, refusing to give the English the honorable combat they so desperately craved. It was a masterpiece of psychological torture. By the time the starving English army finally reached the distant southern coast at Bordeaux, the illusion of their supremacy had completely shattered. Nearly half of their mighty force had perished from severe malnutrition and brutal winter weather. They had lost thousands of immensely expensive war horses, forcing proud armored knights to trudge miserably through the freezing mud like common foot soldiers. The English had technically marched undefeated across hundreds of miles of enemy territory, yet they had suffered a catastrophic strategic defeat. The myth of English invincibility was not broken by a superior rival army, but rather swallowed whole by the vast, empty geography of France itself. Du Guesclin had successfully weaponized the very landscape against the invaders, turning the vast French interior into an unforgiving death trap. Furthermore, the brutal financial reality of this new warfare began to violently crush the domestic English economy. Winning a single glorious battle like Crécy brought immense plunder, gold, and highly lucrative aristocratic ransoms. War in the early years was a remarkably profitable corporate venture for the English nobility, but maintaining permanent stone garrisons deep inside hostile territory proved to be a staggering financial black hole. To defend against constant, invisible guerrilla raids, the English crown had to continuously pay for professional standing armies. The frustrated English Parliament, exhausted by endless requests for heavier taxation, began to bitterly turn against their own ambitious monarchy. The common English citizens were paying exorbitant taxes for a distant foreign war that was suddenly yielding absolutely no measurable wealth or tangible geographic gains. This economic strain fractured the political stability of England itself. The once unified nobility began to squabble over dwindling resources and failing foreign campaigns. The merchants of London demanded accountability for their stolen silver. The war was no longer exporting violence and plunder. It was now slowly importing deep economic depression and toxic political division back into the heart of the English capital. The golden era of English dominance officially died squalidly in the mud and disease of the continent. The legendary Black Prince, the undefeated terror of the French battlefields, and the absolute epitome of martial chivalry, did not die a hero's death in glorious combat. He slowly succumbed to a horrific, lingering bowel disease contracted during his relentless, exhausting southern campaigns. His demise was a monumental psychological blow to the English morale. Shortly after his death, the once mighty King Edward III passed away in London. The glorious conqueror had reduced into a frail, senile old man, manipulated by corrupt courtiers and discarded by history. The original arrogant architects of the Great Continental War were now dead, leaving a bankrupt and failing legacy to their utterly unprepared heirs. What began decades earlier as a supreme arrogant dispute between two vain monarchs over archaic feudal titles had irreversibly mutated. It was no longer a personal royal feud between distant cousins over the vineyards of Aquitaine. The constant shared suffering, the endless brutal raids, and the intense mutual hatred were slowly forging something entirely unprecedented within the peasantry of both nations. Out of the smoldering ashes of the dying feudal system, the faint, terrifying silhouette of modern national identity was slowly beginning to take its shape. The French stopped seeing themselves as mere servants of the Duke of Burgundy or Orléans and began identifying by their shared sufferings under the English. Strategy had triumphed over honor, but it had also unleashed the inescapable spirit of nationalism. The glorious theater of knightly combat was quietly replaced by the invisible grinding machinery of logistical exhaustion. Chapter 7. The Girl Who Changed Everything. How do you resurrect a nation that has already completely died? By the early 15th century, France was not merely defeated. It was utterly crushed both physically and spiritually. King Henry V of England had slaughtered an entire generation of proud French nobility at the brutal Battle of Agincourt. The subsequent Treaty of Troyes directly handed the sacred French crown over to the English monarchy. The legitimate French heir, the Dauphin Charles, was ruthlessly stripped of his birthright by his own mother. He hid like a pathetic exile in the gloomy castles of Bourges, surrounded by desperate courtiers. The entire northern half of France, including the sacred capital of Paris, was firmly controlled by the merciless English and their brutal Burgundian allies. The soul of the nation was effectively extinguished. When secular political logic and astute military strategy completely reach a dead end, humanity often looks desperately towards supernatural miracles. Out of this absolute darkness and void stepped an illiterate 17-year-old peasant girl from a remote village. She claimed to hear the voices of God, bearing an absolutely sacred mission to save France. Her name was Joan of Arc. Consider the profound absurdity and desperation of this historical moment. A terrified, cowardly French prince actually handed ultimate military command to a teenage peasant girl, possessing absolutely no combat experience. This did not occur because Charles suddenly became a devout believer. It exposed the sickening desperation of a ruling class that had lost every earthly gamble and was forced to bet on pure madness. Joan completely shattered every established rule of the 100 Years' War. Before her arrival, this was a private feudal dispute between kings over territory and highly lucrative ransoms. Joan violently elevated this mundane conflict into an uncompromising, sacred holy war. She told the starving soldiers that they were no longer bleeding for a greedy lord, but fighting directly for the divine will of God. This radical psychological shift unleashed a terrifying power upon the battlefield. Under the broken walls of Orleans, the demoralized French garrison suddenly exploded with chilling fanaticism behind a teenage girl holding a white banner. The proud English longbowmen were absolutely horrified. They were no longer fighting traditional feudal mercenaries. They were facing a relentless tide of national martyrs who completely welcomed death. Chivalric vanity clashed violently against absolute faith. In merely a few months, Joan achieved military miracles that generations of aristocratic generals had completely failed to accomplish. She lifted the deadly siege of Orleans and escorted Charles straight through enemy territory to the Cathedral of Reims. There, Charles was officially crowned king, striking a fatal psychological blow to the legitimacy of the English occupation. Yet the cruelty of history dictates that pure heroes rarely survive within the filthy swamps of politics. When Joan's utility was exhausted by the cold crown, she was mercilessly abandoned. She was captured by enemies and burned alive at the stake in Rouen as a heretic. The English foolishly believed the fire would extinguish the rebellion, completely unaware that the flames actually forged the invincible French national soul. When the cold calculations of rational politics lead to absolute destruction, only the blind fervor of pure faith can ignite the flames of resurrection. Chapter 8. The Fall of England. How does an empire that won every major battle suddenly lose the entire war? The execution of Joan of Arc did not stop the French momentum. It merely shifted the conflict from spiritual fervor to cold, industrial efficiency. King Charles VII, once a trembling exile, now possessed the crown and the divine right. He used this unassailable legitimacy to begin systematically dismantling the English occupation. The turning point was not a glorious cavalry charge, but a quiet diplomatic betrayal. In 1435, the powerful Duke of Burgundy, England's most crucial continental ally, calculated that the wind had permanently changed direction. He signed the Treaty of Arras, reconciling with Charles and completely severing his ties with London. England was suddenly left entirely isolated on the continent. Without their wealthy Burgundian allies, the English supply lines stretched to the absolute breaking point. Meanwhile, Charles VII initiated the most radical military reform in French history. He completely discarded the unreliable feudal levies and established the Compagnies d'Ordonnance, Europe's very first professional standing army. Soldiers were now paid directly by the crown, subject to strict discipline, and banned from pillage. Furthermore, the French embraced the terrifying future of warfare, artillery. Two brothers, Jean and Gaspard Bureau, revolutionized siege mechanics by mass, producing highly mobile, exceptionally lethal bronze cannons. The sturdy stone castles that once protected the English garrisons for decades were now effortlessly smashed into rubble in a matter of mere days. The feudal fortress could no longer resist the industrial power of the centralized state. As France rapidly modernized, England fatally collapsed inward. The English crown had passed to King Henry VI, a weak, deeply pious, and mentally unstable monarch who despised the very concept of war. The English nobility, deprived of their highly lucrative plunder from France, turned their violent ambitions desperately against one another. The seeds of the devastating Wars of the Roses were already sprouting within the halls of Westminster. The final annihilation occurred at the Battle of Castillon in 1453. It was a complete and tragic reversal of Crécy. The English commander, John Talbot, blinded by the outdated fantasies of chivalric glory, ordered a reckless frontal assault against a heavily fortified French artillery encampment. The English infantry were absolutely shredded by point-blank cannon fire. Before they even reached the enemy lines, the invincible English machine was finally destroyed. The massive empire that had swallowed the continent for over a century evaporated almost overnight. By the end of the year, England had lost absolutely every single continental possession except for the tiny port city of Calais. The long, bloody relay race had concluded, leaving the English aristocracy bankrupt, defeated, and desperately trapped on their isolated island. The romantic age of the feudal knight was violently replaced by the cold efficiency of the professional soldier and the roar of gunpowder. Chapter 9. The Birth of a Nation. How do we measure the true cost of a conflict that devoured 5 entire generations of human lives? When the smoke finally cleared across the devastated continent in 1453, the world had irreversibly transformed. The tragic irony of the 100 Years' War is that the very institutions that ignited the bloodshed were ultimately destroyed by it. The archaic feudal system lay dead and buried beneath the mud of Castillon. The French kings initially started the conflict merely to protect their dynastic inheritance and consolidate their feudal authority. Yet the relentless shared suffering of the peasantry forged something infinitely more powerful than any royal decree. The people no longer identified themselves solely as subjects of the Duke of Burgundy or the Count of Armagnac. Through the brutal crucible of endless trauma, they finally began to call themselves French. Across the Channel, the English experienced an equally profound psychological metamorphosis. By violently losing their ancestral continental empire, they were suddenly forced to look inward. The deep humiliation of defeat ultimately severed their psychological attachment to Europe, compelling them to fully embrace their true geographic destiny as an isolated island nation. Their staggering loss in France unintentionally laid the crucial foundation for their future global maritime empire. We often look back at history, desperately searching for noble heroes and romantic legends to comfort our modern sensibilities. But the brutal reality uncovered beneath the banners tells a substantially darker story. The great conflict was never truly about honor, justice, or the divine right of kings. It was an excruciating, century-long labor pain that violently birthed the highly centralized political structures we live within today. The peasantry eventually realized that the armored aristocrats could neither feed nor protect them. The invention of gunpowder and the creation of professional standing armies brutally democratized the power of violence, stripping the nobility of their absolute monopoly on force. The kings had foolishly summoned the uncontrollable spirit of nationalism to win a personal feud, completely unaware that this exact same spirit would eventually demand their own downfall. We have journeyed deeply through the darkness of human ambition, witnessing how arrogance ignites wars and how shared suffering unexpectedly forges identity. Thank you for walking through this exhausting and monumental chapter of human history with me. If you found value in this deep historical exploration, please like this video and subscribe to my channel for more rational perspectives on our shared past. If nations are born in war, then what is the price of identity? The ultimate legacy of a century of carnage was the violent eradication of feudal loyalty and the inevitable dawn of the modern nation-state.